What if the most explosive moment in daytime television wasn't planned? What if it wasn't scripted, wasn't staged, and wasn't something any producer in that building saw coming? What if, on one perfectly ordinary morning, underneath the bright studio lights of one of America's most watched talk shows, a conversation about a comedy prize, a prize of all things, cracked open something so raw, so deeply divided, so politically charged, that the women sitting at that famous table could no longer pretend to hold it together? No one expected it to go this far. That's the thing about The View. You tune in thinking you know what you're going to get. Hot topics, sharp opinions, spirited debate, a little laughter maybe, some applause, maybe a raised eyebrow. You've seen it 100 times. The hosts disagree, they push back, they laugh it off, they go to commercial. That's the rhythm, that's the formula. That's what keeps millions of Americans coming back every single morning. But on this particular morning, something was different. The tension was already bubbling before the cameras even rolled. There was an energy in that studio, a restlessness, an undercurrent that anyone watching closely could feel. Because the story at the center of the day's hot topics wasn't just about a comedian winning an award. It was about something much bigger than that. It was about power. It was about who gets to be honored in America. It was about whose voice gets amplified, whose gets silenced, and who gets to decide. And it was about a president who, no matter how many times you think you've seen every move he has, still finds a way to surprise you. This story begins with Bill Maher, comedian, provocateur, television host, a man who has spent the better part of 3 decades saying out loud the things that most people only dare to think. And it ends, or rather it detonates, with a moment so raw, so charged, so completely unfiltered that viewers watching from their living rooms could feel the temperature in that studio drop 10 degrees in a single breath. This is that story. This is what really happened on The View, the day Bill Maher's name became the spark that lit the fuse. Because this wasn't just about a prize. This wasn't just about a comedian or a ceremony or a golden statue in Washington. This was about what America believes in, who America celebrates, and what happens when two women who have spent years sitting at the same table, laughing at the same jokes, and fighting for the same country suddenly find themselves staring across a divide so wide they can barely hear each other anymore. You won't believe how it ends. Section 2. Background Setup. To understand what happened on that stage, you have to understand the landscape that surrounded it. You have to go back, not decades, not years, but just weeks, to the moment when the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor became the most politically loaded award in the country. The Mark Twain Prize is not a small thing. It is, by any measure, the highest honor in American comedy. Named after the man who once said that the secret source of humor is not joy but sorrow, the prize has been awarded to legends, to icons, to people who redefined what it means to make an audience laugh. Whoopi Goldberg received it, Billy Crystal received it, Lily Tomlin, Dave Chappelle. These are not casual names. These are people who shaped American culture, American consciousness, and American conversation. And the ceremony, for years and years, was held at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., one of the great cultural monuments of the United States, named for a president who believed deeply in the power of art to unite a divided nation. The Kennedy Center was sacred ground for American creativity, a place where politics was supposed to stop at the door. Was supposed to. Because here is where the story gets complicated. Here is where the ground beneath the awards started to shift. Because the Kennedy Center, in the months leading up to this particular ceremony, was no longer quite the same institution it had been. A new name had been attached to its entrance, a new board had been installed, and suddenly, the question of who gets honored inside those walls and who gets to have a say in that decision was no longer as simple as it once seemed. The Mark Twain Prize itself, it must be understood, is not technically awarded by the Kennedy Center. It is a separate entity. A committee of distinguished figures selects the recipient. The ceremony simply takes place at the Kennedy Center, the way a wedding takes place at a venue. You rent the hall, you hold your event. The venue doesn't choose your vows. But what had changed, what was now making everyone in the entertainment world and the political world look twice, was that the Kennedy Center's newly appointed board was now playing a joint role in the decision-making process. The loyalists who now sat on that board were being given a seat at the table, a voice in who gets the prize, a fingerprint on one of comedy's most sacred traditions. And then came the announcement. Bill Maher, comedian, provocateur, television host, a man who has spent the better part of 3 decades saying out loud the things that most people only dare to think. And it ends, or rather it detonates, with a moment so raw, so charged, so completely unfiltered that viewers watching from their living rooms could feel the temperature in that studio drop 10 degrees in a single breath. This is that story. This is what really happened on The View, the day Bill Maher's name became the spark that lit the fuse. Because this wasn't just about a prize. This wasn't just about a comedian or a ceremony or a golden statue in Washington. This was about what America believes in, who America celebrates, and what happens when two women who have spent years sitting at the same table, laughing at the same jokes, and fighting for the same country, suddenly find themselves staring across a divide so wide they can barely hear each other anymore. You won't believe how it ends. Section 2. Background Setup. To understand what happened on that stage, you have to understand the landscape that surrounded it. You have to go back, not decades, not years, but just weeks, to the moment when the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor became the most politically loaded award in the country. The Mark Twain Prize is not a small thing. It is, by any measure, the highest honor in American comedy. Named after the man who once said that the secret source of humor is not joy but sorrow, the prize has been awarded to legends, to icons, to people who redefined what it means to make an audience laugh. Whoopi Goldberg received it, Billy Crystal received it, Lily Tomlin, Dave Chappelle. These are not casual names. These are people who shaped American culture, American consciousness, and American conversation. And the ceremony, for years and years, was held at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., one of the great cultural monuments of the United States, named for a president who believed deeply in the power of art to unite a divided nation. The Kennedy Center was sacred ground for American creativity, a place where politics was supposed to stop at the door. Was supposed to. Because here is where the story gets complicated. Here is where the ground beneath the awards started to shift. Because the Kennedy Center, in the months leading up to this particular ceremony, was no longer quite the same institution it had been. A new name had been attached to its entrance, a new board had been installed, and suddenly, the question of who gets honored inside those walls and who gets to have a say in that decision was no longer as simple as it once seemed. The Mark Twain Prize itself, it must be understood, is not technically awarded by the Kennedy Center. It is a separate entity. A committee of distinguished figures selects the recipient. The ceremony simply takes place at the Kennedy Center, the way a wedding takes place at a venue. You rent the hall, you hold your event, the venue doesn't choose your vows. But what had changed, what was now making everyone in the entertainment world and the political world look twice, was that the Kennedy Center's newly appointed board was now playing a joint role in the decision-making process. The loyalists who now sat on that board were being given a seat at the table, a voice in who gets the prize, a fingerprint on one of comedy's most sacred traditions. And then came the announcement. Bill Maher, sharp-tongued, fearless, controversial, beloved and despised in equal measure, was set to receive this year's Mark Twain Prize for American Humor. The White House called it fake news. Let that settle for a moment. The White House, the office of the President of the United States, issued a statement saying that the news of Bill Maher receiving the Mark Twain Prize was simply not true. Fake, a fabrication, a lie being spread by the media. It was not fake. Bill Maher was receiving the award. And almost simultaneously, in a move that no one could claim was coincidental, the Speaker of the House appeared at a ceremony of his own, a ceremony for the President, and announced the creation of a brand new award, never before given, never before conceived, created apparently on the spot, or very close to it. A golden statue, a prize for a man who already held the most powerful office on earth. The America First Award, presented to a sitting president by his own political party. At the same moment, the news broke that a comedian who had repeatedly and publicly criticized that same president was about to receive one of the most prestigious honors in American cultural life. This was the world that The View walked into that morning. This was the air in the room. This was the match that had already been struck before anyone sat down. And the women at that table, Whoopi Goldberg, Joy Behar, Sunny Hostin, Sarah Haynes, and guest co-host Abby Huntsman, had all read the same news. They all knew the story. They had all formed opinions. And several of them, including Joy Behar, who has never in her long career at that table been accused of holding back, and Anna Navarro, the sharp-elbowed Republican turned independent who has built a career on saying what other conservatives are too careful to say, were not going to let this moment pass without comment. That much was certain. What was not certain was just how far the conversation would go before it broke. Section 3. The Build-Up. The show opened the way it always does. The announcer's voice, the music, the applause. The women came out smiling, settled into their seats, adjusted their microphones, and the audience, hundreds of people packed into that studio ready for the energy of the morning, greeted them with warmth and enthusiasm. Whoopi Goldberg, the anchor of the table, the woman who has moderated more explosive conversations than perhaps any other host in television history, set the scene with her characteristic mix of directness and calm. She had been through this before. She had sat at that table through presidential elections, through national tragedies, through cultural earthquakes. She was not easily rattled. She introduced the topic with the kind of measured authority that comes from decades of experience. The news about Bill Maher, the Mark Twain Prize, the White House denial, the America First Award, the Golden Statue. She laid it all out, piece by piece, the way a skilled lawyer presents evidence, letting each element sink in before moving to the next. And the table was warm. The mood was, for a moment, almost playful. There was laughter about the golden statue. There were raised eyebrows and gentle ribbing. Sarah Haynes made a remark about the Speaker of the House reading his lines without conviction. Abby Huntsman, the guest co-host, a Republican from one of America's most prominent political families, leaned back in her chair and smiled, the easy, open smile of someone who had walked into a room of people she genuinely liked and was happy to be there. For a few minutes, it felt like any other morning. Joy Behar was at her most Joy Behar, quick, dry, devastating in her efficiency. She had a joke about a McDonald's French fry certification that landed perfectly, the kind of throwaway line that sounds offhand but is actually constructed with precision. The audience laughed, the hosts laughed. There was a rhythm to it, a momentum. Sunny Hostin, the former federal prosecutor who approaches every conversation with the methodical discipline of someone building a case, began to lay out the legal and institutional questions at the heart of the story. Who controls the Mark Twain Prize now? Who gets to have a say? What happens to an award that was once decided by an independent committee when that committee is now required to share its decision with a board appointed by the very person who benefits from the award being given or withheld? These were not casual questions. They were pointed, and they introduced something into the air of the studio that hadn't been there a moment before. A quiet, barely perceptible shift. Because here's the thing about The View at its most interesting. It is not the moments when the hosts violently disagree with each other that define the show. It is the moments when they disagree in ways they haven't fully anticipated. When a topic lands differently than expected. When someone says something that sits just a little wrong with someone else. When the tension arrives not like a thunderstorm, but like a slow pressure change, the kind you feel in your ears before you can see any clouds. That pressure was building now. Abby Huntsman, to her credit, was honest about where she stood politically. She was a Republican. She came from a Republican family. She had conservative values that she carried with her even as she sat at a table where she was, in many ways, the outlier. And on this particular topic, on the question of Bill Maher, free speech, and what it means to accept an award in a political climate this charged, she had thoughts, real thoughts, personal thoughts, not talking points. She talked about the importance of free speech. She talked about her admiration for Bill Maher's willingness to say what he believes regardless of who is in the room. She talked about walking into the building that morning and talking to crew members, security guards, people who worked behind the scenes, and feeling, for the first time in a long time, something like hope. Because these people, regardless of their politics, regardless of their backgrounds, all wanted the same things. They wanted their children to be healthy. They wanted opportunity. They wanted goodness. It was a genuine, heartfelt speech. The audience responded with applause. But underneath the warmth of that moment, underneath the applause and the earnest emotion, something else was happening. Because the question of whether Bill Maher should accept the award from an institution now partially controlled by people appointed by a president he had spent years publicly criticizing was not a settled question. It was not something everyone at that table saw the same way. And Joy Behar was not going to let it stay unsettled. It started, as the best confrontations always do, with a question that seemed reasonable on the surface. Joy Behar has a gift. It is not simply a gift for comedy, though she has that in abundance. It is a gift for the perfectly timed observation, the remark that appears to be casual and off the cuff, but is actually a surgical instrument. She has been doing this for decades. She knows exactly what she is doing when she opens her mouth, and she knows exactly where she wants the conversation to go. She started with the Golden Statue, the America First Award. She let herself be amused by it, visibly, audibly amused, in a way that communicated volumes without requiring a single serious sentence. The audience laughed, the hosts laughed, and then, almost imperceptibly, Joy shifted. She shifted from the absurdity of the self-given award to something sharper, something about who gets to decide what is honored in America, something about what it means when a prize that has always existed outside the realm of politics is suddenly touched by politics. And in that shift, she was not just talking about the golden statue anymore. She was talking about Bill Maher. She was talking about the Mark Twain Award. She was talking about what it means to sit inside an institution that has been changed, even partially, even symbolically, by a political force you have spent your career opposing. The temperature in the room moved. It was barely perceptible at first, a tightening around the table, a slight shift in posture. Whoopi, who feels these changes the way a captain feels a change in the wind, watched carefully. Sunny Hostin continued building her case, methodical, precise, adding context and legal nuance to what was becoming an increasingly charged debate. The appointed board, the changed process, the question of artistic independence versus institutional control. And then, Ana Navarro spoke. Beat. Ana Navarro, who was not at the table that particular morning, but whose voice and presence hangs over any conversation about Republicans, conservatives, and political integrity on The View like a permanent resident. Ana, whose entire brand is built on being the Republican who will say what Republicans don't say, who will criticize her own party with a ferocity that sometimes even her liberal colleagues pause. Ana had a perspective on this that was not the same as Joy's, not at all. Because Ana, for all her willingness to criticize, also believes something fundamental about the power of showing up, about not ceding ground to the people you disagree with by default, simply because you refuse to enter the room. The argument that crystallized at that table was this: Joy believed, clearly, unmistakably, with the certainty of someone who has held the same conviction for years, that accepting an honor from an institution that has been compromised, even partially, is itself a form of legitimization. That to walk into that space, to stand at that podium, to take that prize with cameras rolling, is to say, on some level, that you accept the terms of the arrangement, that you are willing to play by the new rules. And Ana, represented by the spirit and philosophy she had brought to The View over years of sitting at that very table, believed something entirely different. Ana believed that the only way to preserve the integrity of a prize like the Mark Twain Award is to show up and claim it, to refuse to let political operatives decide who does and doesn't deserve to be honored, to stand in the room and be exactly who you are, saying exactly what you would say anywhere else, without apology, without compromise, without giving an inch. These are not small disagreements. These are not the kinds of disagreements you resolve over coffee. These are fundamental, philosophical divides about how you fight back, about what integrity looks like, about whether standing your ground sometimes means walking away, or whether walking away is itself a surrender. The table felt it. The audience felt it. Joy's jaw was set. Her words were clipped and precise, landing like individual notes rather than flowing sentences. She was not raising her voice. Joy Behar almost never raises her voice, which is part of what makes her so effective, but the economy of her language communicated something unmistakable. She was not budging. She was not entertaining the other side as a serious alternative. She had considered the question, she had reached her conclusion, and she was now in the business of defending it. Whoopi stepped in, gently, carefully, the way a moderator does when she feels the conversation tipping past productive disagreement towards something more combustible. She offered context. She offered nuance. She reminded everyone at the table that the Mark Twain Prize is not, strictly speaking, an award given by the Kennedy Center. It is an award that happens to be hosted at the Kennedy Center. The distinction matters. The venue is not the institution. The hall is not the award. But Joy was not moved by the distinction, or rather, she was moved by it only enough to acknowledge it before circling back to her point. The distinction doesn't change the optics. It doesn't change what it looks like to the public. It doesn't change what the image communicates when a comedian who has spent years opposing this administration walks into a building now bearing his name and accepts a prize whose selection process now includes his appointees. Sonny Hostin, always careful to bring receipts to any argument, laid out what had changed about the award's selection process since previous recipients, including Whoopi herself, had received it. The decision was now jointly made. The board Trump had appointed was now in a position to weigh in. Whether they had in this specific case was a separate question, but the architecture of influence was now in place. Sarah Haynes, who often plays the role of the thoughtful middle, the person who can hold two contradictory ideas at once without feeling the need to resolve them immediately, offered something more human. She talked about watching the ceremony clip, about the discomfort of seeing an award created in the moment and given to a sitting president by his own political allies. She talked about the feeling of watching someone read lines they clearly hadn't written, presenting a trophy that had never existed until the night before to the most powerful man in the country. There was something in that observation, something about the nakedness of the performance, the visible mechanics of it, the absence of any pretense that landed differently at the table. It cut through the philosophical argument for a moment and brought everyone back to the visceral reality of what they had all just watched. And Joy seized the opening, because Joy Behar, above almost everything else, is a woman who understands the power of the perfectly placed observation at the perfectly chosen moment. She had been listening. She had been letting the argument breathe, and now she made her move, not with volume, not with aggression, but with the kind of quiet, devastating clarity that is, in its own way, louder than shouting. She said what she thought, simply, directly, without softening it, without qualifying it, without the diplomatic padding that political television conversations usually wrap around their sharpest edges. She said it out loud, and the room changed.
There are moments in live television that you cannot predict and cannot contain. Moments when the machinery of the show, the cameras, the producers, the commercial breaks, the carefully maintained rhythm of hot topics and guest segments simply cannot keep pace with what is actually happening between human beings in real time. This was one of those moments. The word that hung in the air after Joy finished speaking was not anger. It was not outrage in the conventional sense. It was something sharper and in many ways more difficult to navigate. It was conviction. The kind of conviction that does not invite rebuttal because it has already considered and rejected every possible rebuttal. The kind of conviction that looks at the other side of the argument and says with complete sincerity, "I hear you, I understand you, and I disagree with you completely." And what happened next, what no one in that studio was entirely prepared for, what the producers watching from behind their monitors did not see coming in the final seconds before it unfolded, was not a shouting match. It was not a table flip or a dramatic storming off set. It was something quieter, and in its quietness, far more powerful. It was a refusal to continue. Not a permanent refusal, not a melodramatic exit, but a genuine, principled withdrawal from a conversation that had reached a point where continuing it felt, to at least one person at that table, like a betrayal of what she actually believed, like pretending the disagreement was smaller than it was, like performing civility over a divide that deserved to be acknowledged in full. The mic was not thrown. It was not slammed on the table. But there was a moment, a specific, visible, unmistakable moment, when the conversation simply stopped, when the energy that had been building across the entire segment reached its apex, and rather than resolving into laughter or consensus or the usual gentle pivot to the next topic, it simply landed and stayed landed. The audience felt it, not in the way audiences feel a deliberate dramatic moment, not with the gasp of a crowd watching a stunt, but in the way audiences feel something real, something unscripted, something that reminds you, even in the middle of a polished commercial-sponsored multi-camera television production, that the people on that stage are actual people with actual beliefs that they carry with them everywhere, including to work. Whoopi looked at the table. Sarah Haynes looked at the table. The moment was brief, but it was real, And in the world of live television, brief and real is everything. The show went to commercial. When the show came back from break, the temperature had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that the casual viewer might immediately identify, but for anyone who had been watching closely, for the millions of people who tune into The View not just for the headlines, but for the texture of the conversation, for the subtle signals that pass between these women who have sat together at that table through years of history, something was different. The conversation moved on. It had to. That is the nature of live television. You get back from commercial and you find the next topic and you carry the energy forward, whatever that energy is, wherever it has been left. There were other stories to discuss. There was Savannah Guthrie's devastating interview about her missing mother. There were guests to welcome. There was basketball and hair care and the business of a show that must fill its minutes and deliver its content and send its audience off into their day. But the moment had happened. It was already out there, in the air, in the recordings, in the consciousness of everyone who had witnessed it. And in the days that followed, in the corners of the internet where The View is discussed with the intensity of a contact sport, in the comment sections, in the reaction videos, in the hot take columns, the question of what exactly had happened at that table became its own conversation. Some viewers sided firmly with Joy. They saw in her position a principled stand against the slow normalization of political influence over cultural institutions. They argued that the Mark Twain Prize, precisely because it has always represented something independent and irreverent and distinctly American, deserved to be protected from the optics of political entanglement. That walking into a space now partially shaped by the very administration you have spent years criticizing sends a message, whether you intended to or not, and that message matters. Others sided just as firmly with the opposing view, the view that refusing to engage, refusing to show up, refusing to stand in the room and be exactly who you are, is itself a form of surrender. That the greatest threat to institutions like the Mark Twain Prize is not the presence of political influence, but the departure of the very people who have always been its heart. That you don't protect a prize by staying away from it. You protect it by claiming it, loudly, proudly, on your own terms. Both of these positions are defensible. Both of them reflect real values held by real people across the entire political spectrum. And that, in many ways, is what made the conversation at The View that morning so compelling and so difficult to dismiss. It was not a debate between sense and nonsense. It was a debate between two different kinds of sense. The social media response was immediate and enormous. Clips of the exchange were shared tens of thousands of times within hours of the broadcast. Comment sections filled with passionate, often profane, frequently insightful arguments that mirrored in their own messy and democratic way exactly the argument that had played out on camera. People were not just talking about Bill Maher anymore. They were talking about what the argument revealed, about politics, about culture, about the nature of integrity and the price of principle. Late-night hosts took notice. Entertainment reporters filed stories. Political commentators who rarely have an occasion to discuss daytime talk shows found themselves pulled into a conversation that had somehow become a proxy for something much larger. Because the question at the center of the View exchange, whether to accept legitimacy on compromised terms or to refuse it entirely and risk irrelevance, is not a question that applies only to comedian prizes or television awards. It is a question that applies to every institution, every profession, every individual navigating a political moment as destabilizing as the one America is currently living through. Abby Huntsman, who had spent the entire week at The View as guest co-host, and who, by her own admission, had walked into the building feeling politically lost and heartbroken, offered perhaps the most quietly powerful reflection of the entire episode. She talked about what it felt like to walk those halls every morning, to talk to the security guards and the crew members, to hear their stories about what they wanted for their children, for their country, for the future. She talked about the realization, slow, accumulating, genuine, that beneath all the political division and the partisan noise and the exhausting daily churn of outrage and counter-outrage, most people still want the same things. She said something that stayed with a lot of people who watched. We are bigger than this, all of us. We are bigger than the argument. We are bigger than the prize. We are bigger than the golden statue and the fake news denial and the America First Award and the Kennedy conversion controversy and all the ways in which the machinery of power tries to reduce everything, even comedy, even culture, even the legacy of Mark Twain, to a chess piece in a political game. We are bigger than that. Whether or not you agree with Abby Huntsman's politics, and plenty of the people sitting at that table and plenty of the people watching at home do not, that observation landed. It landed because it was true, and because it was the kind of truth that people are hungry for when they have been living inside a news cycle that makes smallness feel inevitable. The conversation continued in living rooms and offices and group chats across the country for days. It became, in the peculiar way that view conversations sometimes do, a Rorschach test, something onto which people projected their own beliefs, their own fears, their own sense of what is and is not worth fighting for. Step back from the heat of it for a moment. Step back from the clips and the reactions and the social media arguments and the late-night jokes and the talk show follow-ups. Step all the way back and look at what actually happened at that table on that morning. What happened was not really about Bill Maher. Bill Maher is a vessel in this story, not the story itself. He is the occasion for the argument, not the argument. He is a man who has stood in rooms where he wasn't entirely welcome and said the things that made people uncomfortable and trusted that the discomfort was worth something. He has criticized the left when it suited him. He has criticized the right when it suited him. He has consistently, almost perversely, refused to make himself easy to categorize. And in doing so, he has become something that American cultural life genuinely needs and genuinely struggles to contain. A person who cannot be fully claimed by either side. Which is exactly why his name lit the fuse at that table. Because the argument that broke open at the View that morning was not about Bill Maher deserving the Mark Twain Prize. Everyone at that table, when pressed, would probably agree that he does. The argument was about something deeper and harder and more important. What do you do when the institutions that honor the things you love have been touched by the forces you distrust? What do you do when the spaces where culture is celebrated have been politically colonized, even partially, even symbolically, by a power you have spent your career opposing? Do you walk away and let those spaces be abandoned to the forces you fear? Or do you walk in and reclaim them, even knowing that your presence might be used, twisted, cited as evidence of legitimacy you never intended to grant? This is not a new question. It is in many ways the defining question of any cultural or political resistance. Do you boycott or do you engage? Do you refuse to participate in systems you believe are corrupt, or do you fight from within them? History offers no clear